Hello, I'm Kaiser and welcome to Moose Reads. Today's video is a little different. Generally, the most planning I do for my reading is that I want to read 4 types of book each month. 1 book I own physically, 1 I own digitally, 1 from the library, and 1 from my book club. After that, I just read whatever I feel like reading. I've set a rule for myself that unless I am actively DNFing a book, I will not start another until I've finished. The exception being that I can read 1 physical book and 1 digital book simultaneously, because there are circumstances where physical books just aren't all that feasible. But a while ago I was watching YouTube videos because I didn't feel like reading, and one of the videos recommended to me was the 2024 Read Your Bookshelf Challenge. I will link that in the description and add an end card if I'm doing this right. I watched it, and I thought maybe I'd give it a shot. The people putting the challenge together state explicitly that it doesn't have to be books you own, but the whole point of me participating is to get through my owned books. I am specifically going to try to focus on my physically owned books because I keep buying digital books for free through BookBub and Stuff Your Kindle days, and that list will never die. However, there are a few points at which I have no choice but to stray into the digital collection. I'm not sure anyone actually cares what my reading plans are, but I figured if I'm doing the challenge, I should figure out which books I should not read beforehand and which books I might need to read beforehand in order to make it work. So I thought I might as well make a video about it. If you're watching this before the end of 2024, maybe you'll do a pseudo buddy read with me. Anyway, the way the challenge works is that there are 2 themed paths. There is the Montgomery path and the Doyle path, and they cross over 3 times, so you can start on one and later switch to the other. I have too much time on my hands, read nearly 100 books this year, and occasionally like to overachieve, so I'm just going to do both paths in their entirety with one-ish exception. There are 2 prompts for each path in December, so that should be fun. Anyway, from here on out, I will be awkwardly boxed in by the prompts and the books I've chosen. Montgomery on my right, Doyle on my left. I will not be reading the descriptions of these books, partly because there are 23 of them and that would really bloat the video, partly because several of them are going to be sequels. The descriptions I usually read are just pulled from the Amazon listing, so if you're really curious, you can look them up. Here we go. January. The Montgomery prompt is a book with a cat on the cover. I don't own any books with a cat on the cover, at least not on the front cover. I did, by pure chance, notice that there is a cat on the back of Mossflower though, so I'm counting it. I read my first Redwall book in like 5th grade, fell in love, and bought all of the series that was out at the time or came out before I got distracted, which totals 13 books. I'm reading these in chronological order, not release order. So I started with Lord Brocktree, and I need to read Mossflower in January. There is, however, a book between those 2, so I will also read Martin the Warrior in January. After this, my plan is to read 1 Redwall a month, so I'll mention that going forward as well. The Doyle prompt is a book with a dog on the cover, which is slightly easier. The obvious choice from my collection is Plague Dogs by Richard Adams. I loved the Watership Down movie as a kid, read the book in middle school, loved it, and then read the short story collection from that world and loved it even more. So I also bought Plague Dogs on the theory that I liked the man's writing and I like dogs, so I might like it. And then I never read it. I don't think I knew what it was about when I bought it. Eventually, I saw there was a cartoon movie for it too and watched it, at which point I found out and then was extremely hesitant to read it because I don't think the ending is very nice. I could be wrong though, you never know with adaptation decay. Either way, I've owned it forever and meant to read it forever, and it's time. Also, I know at least some of my book club books, so I'll go ahead and mention those as well. I've been trying to stay 2 months ahead because I get these from the library, but that's not a guarantee. I'll say what book we're discussing for the month, but aside from February's book, I may read them earlier. January's book is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir, which I've already read, and the review should be posted already. February. Montgomery prompt is to read a book over 400 pages. For this, I will be reading Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. I watched the series they made of this back in 2010, and I really enjoyed it, although I remember pretty much nothing about it. I bought the book shortly after that, but I started reading it, got distracted, and never finished. Seems like I'm well overdue. It is 983 pages, well over the mark, and entirely too long for a short month. It's also, I've just learned, not a standalone as I'd believed, but the first in a 5-book series, so that could be a problem for me down the road. Oh well. Doyle Prompt is a book under 250 pages. A lot of my digital books would suit this prompt, but I don't have very many physical ones that do. I think I have exactly 2, so I picked one of them. That is Kavik the Wolf Dog by Walt Morey, which is 192 pages. I have no idea where I got this book. Best guess is a book fair as a kid, but who knows. However I got it, I have it, so unless I intend to get rid of it, I need to read it eventually. So here it is. The Redwall book is The Legend of Luke. The book club book is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. March. Montgomery prompt is read a book with 2 POV. This is the first prompt that illustrates the main reason I'm not inclined toward TBR games. Figuring out what meets any given prompt is a pain in the ass. I honestly don't know which of my books are single, double, or multi-POV, nor do I have any idea how to find out. I'm not going to slog through Goodreads lists hoping to find one I own. That's for sure. But I read a lot of romance, and it's usually pretty good for that sort of thing, so I picked A Kiss for Luck by Grace Burrows. This is actually a novella, and it's digital, but all of my romances are digital, so that's just how it's going to be. I got this for free, and I've put it off a lot. I love Grace Burrows' Regency romances. I've read her entire Wyndham series and the first book in the spin-off Wyndham Bride series, and the only thing that kept me from reading more is library access. So when I saw this novella for free, I figured I'd pick it up. It is, however, a contemporary romance, and for reasons I could not possibly explain, I mostly only read contemporary romance if they are queer or about teenagers. It's out of my wheelhouse, is what I'm saying, so this is a good opportunity to force myself to read it. I assume it's dual POV because everything else I've read from her is. If I'm wrong, I'll reevaluate later. Doyle prompt is to read a book with more than 2 POV. This one is much easier because every Redwall book is multi-POV, so for this prompt I will be reading The Outcast of Redwall by Brian Jakes. The book club book is One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. April. This is the first point where the prompts cross over, which means they are both read a book where the main character has red hair. This is also fairly easy, as I have most, if not all, of the Anne of Green Gables series, and have attempted to read it more than once. I like it well enough, but I always get distracted partway through Anne of Avonlea for some reason. I've read Anne of Green Gables twice now, so I'm not going to commit to rereading it, although I suspect that will happen all the same for multiple reasons. Either way, I'm setting Anne of Avonlea as my official Montgomery pick for April, and then Anne of the Island as my Doyle pick, and I'll probably just read 3 of them instead of the 2 I'm promising. We'll see. In case you didn't know, Anne of Green Gables is by L.M. Montgomery, for whom one of these paths is named. Redwall book is Mariel of Redwall. Book club book is Wild and Wicked Things by Francesca May. Speaking of May, the Montgomery prompt here is to read a book by a favorite author. I don't generally have favorite authors. There are only 3 authors for whom I have read their work and decided to seek out more. The first is Richard Adams, but I only own Watership Down and Plague Dogs, and by this point I will have read them. The second is Alexis Hall. The only book of hers I own physically is Boyfriend Material, which I've already read. And the only one I own digitally is Something Fabulous, which I have also read. Also, having read more of her work after Boyfriend Material, I'm not sure I'd even call her a favorite author. The third author, however, is Mo Xiang Tongshu. I watched The Untamed and was vaguely confused by some of the plot and disappointed that the queer romance wasn't as explicit as I'd been led to believe. By which I mean it was subtext, not that it wasn't porn. So then I tracked down the fan translation, read it, and loved it. When I learned it was being released officially in America, I made plans to buy it. I had, by then, also watched the first season of the Heaven Official's Blessing Donghua, and I loved that as well. So I started collecting those too. Actually, I prioritized those because they were new, and then I loved them the most. There will be a video on that series at some point, I promise. But having fallen in love with her other two series, I decided I probably ought to read the third as well. Although I should note that third is not entirely correct, because while I read it third, it was the author's first series. I did not love Scum Villain's self-saving system. There are a lot of reasons for this, which I'm sure I will get to in May, but the important point is that I got halfway through Volume 3 and stopped reading. It wasn't deliberate, I think I just kept putting it off. Either way, I still have 1.5 volumes that I own and haven't read. That's my very long-winded way of saying that for May's Montgomery prompt, I will be reading Scum Villain. Rather than just pick up where I left off or start at the beginning of Volume 3, however, I'm going to commit to reading all 4 volumes in May. Should be fun. Then the Doyle prompt is to read a book by a new author. This seems like it should be easier, except that most of the books I own are part of a series. However, I did recently pick up a book because I enjoyed the movie based on it, and it happens to be from an author I haven't read. So for this, I will be reading The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. Redwall book is The Bellmaker. The book club book is Let the Dead In by Saida Agostini. That brings us to June. The Montgomery prompt here is to read a book of poetry. I hate poetry, so I do not own a single book that would meet this criteria. However, I do own quite a few books that have an obnoxious number of songs and rhyming prophecies in them. So here, I will be continuing my Redwall efforts with Salamandastron. Yes, it's cheating. No, I don't care. And the Doyle prompt is to read a science fiction or fantasy book. I'm just going to go ahead and double up on the Redwall books in June and read Redwall. This is also kind of cheating, as I have read this book at least twice, once fairly recently, but the numbers work out better if I put it here, and this is where it falls in the chronology. Book club book is Willa and Hesper by Amy Feldman. July. July is the second point where the prompts are the same, and you can switch tracks if you're doing this challenge the normal way. The prompt is to read a short story collection. This is another point at which I have to dig into my digital books. I own exactly 1 short story collection physically, and I've already read it. Actually, I might own 2, but if the one I'm thinking of is short stories, I'd have to read 9 books to get to it, and I'm not going to. I do, however, have a digital short story collection, so I will be reading The Fairy Girl and Other Stories by Anthea Sharp. Apparently this is the 3rd book in a 7-book series, but I'm pretty sure it's just a series of 7 short story collections, and this is the only one I own because it was free. Unfortunately, there are 2 prompts each month, and while there will be an exception later, I generally intend to read 2 books even when the prompts are the same. So for the 2nd short story collection, I will be cheating wildly by buying a digital book. Although since my birthday comes before this, and it's on a list of books I want digitally, I may actually own it by then. At any rate, several years back, I read the Captive Prince series by C.S. Pacat. It has some issues that might put some people off, but they didn't put me off, and I enjoyed reading it. And recently, I learned from watching a video from Nat Cat's Bookish Cafe, I don't remember which video, but the channel should be linked below, that there is also a short story collection. So I will be procuring said collection and reading it. Specifically, it is The Summer Palace and Other Stories by C.S. Pacat. I will also be rereading the series because I remember next to nothing about it. It was 2016, I think that's to be expected. This isn't part of the challenge, but since I know it's coming, I figure I might as well mention it. The Redwall book is Matameo. This is, unfortunately, the point where I run out of book club books until we do another round of voting. Maybe I'll start amending these things to my wrap-ups. Moving on to August. The Montgomery prompt is to read a book with water on the cover. Here's one reason why I said the numbers match up better if I read Redwall in June, because Pearl of Lutra happens to have water on the cover and is next. Neat! The Doyle prompt is to read a book with a house on the cover. I don't have a wealth of these, but in an amusing twist, you can generally count on my copies of the Anne of Green Gables books to feature houses, so Anne of Windy Poplars it is. September. Montgomery is to read a book where music is a major part of the story or a historical fiction. I couldn't honestly say if music is a major part of the story for any of my books, unless you want to count the excessive singing in Redwall, which I am not going to do for this prompt. But I do own a very lovely leather-bound bind-up of the works of Jane Austen, which are historical fiction. I will be reading Mansfield Park. The Doyle prompt is a book that involves puzzles, codes, or ciphers, or a mystery. I'm definitely not picking a mystery, but delving into my digital books, I picked up a book called Puzzled by P.J. Nichols, which is entirely about puzzles. It's the first in an 11-book series, which is entirely available on Kindle Unlimited, so I may be setting myself up for trouble here, but I'll risk it. I'm skipping the Redwall book for this month because I need to keep one for December and I'm running out. Also, I expect the Long Patrol will be a bit of a slog, and it'll work better in October. So, October. This is another double prompt and my mortal enemy. Read a nonfiction book. I hate nonfiction. I own exactly 3 nonfiction books, all of which were gifted to me by the same person, 2 of which I've read. That's Hyperbole and a Half and Solutions and Other Problems by Ali Brosh, if you're curious. The one I haven't read is Bad Feminist by Roxane Gay. I will make an effort to read this book because I own it and it meets the prompt, but I will not swear myself to any nonfiction. I will also not bother attempting to read 2 books for the challenge this month. I could reread the Ali Brosh books. It wouldn't even take long, and they're funny, but I'm not going to. The point is to read books that I haven't read, and I've read those. Here I will read The Long Patrol, because I'm only reading 1 physical book this month, and why not read 2 I don't want to read very much? November. Montgomery prompt is to read a second chance book. Depending on what one means by second chance book, I patently refuse. If I purposefully DNF a book, it isn't worth my time, and I'm not going to give it another shot. Using a looser definition of a book I soft DNF'd, of which you may notice there are many, I only have 1 book by this point that meets the criteria, and it's book 3 in a 4-book series I'd have to restart. It's not going to happen. Instead, I'll read a second chance romance. Close enough. This is another thing where I kind of have to look it up to find out which books I own that fit the category, so I did wade through a Goodreads list, which I quickly determined used the phrase quite liberally. But one that I'm pretty sure does actually constitute a second chance romance that I even own physically is Persuasion by Jane Austen. The Doyle prompt is a book that intimidates you. This is also a bit tricky. I don't generally feel intimidated by books. Even extremely long books aren't really all that bothersome to me. If I want to read them, I will. I read Les Miserables and The Count of Monte Cristo for fun, although, admittedly, I started skimming Les Mis after the time skip, because there was only so much worthless description I could take. I also read The Priory of the Orange Tree for book club, and I actually enjoyed that. Big books don't scare me. That being said, there are 2 books that arguably fall into this category. The first is Plague Dogs. I went over that earlier, and I'll have read it by this point. The second is The Mist Reader by Rand and Robin Miller with David Wingrove, which is technically 3 books. I first played the Myst games on PC at least 10 years after Myst came out. I know because I bought the 10th anniversary edition. I fell completely in love with it. I bought all the games on Steam when my discs stopped working. I had a friend who was also really into them, and I think he told me about this book. And I bought it, and I did try to read it, but from what I recall, it was kind of a dry writing style, and I didn't quite get into it. Occasionally, I think I should give it another go, and then I think I should play the games again, and then I do neither. See if I don't do both in November. Also, since this chunky bastard is a bind-up, I'm going to consider it a success if I read one of the 3 books, although I will try to read the whole collection. No Redwall this month because the Mist Reader is a chunky bastard, and I only have one left anyway. Which brings us to December. Each path has 2 prompts for December. If you're doing this like a reasonable person, you pick one of the 2 for whatever path you're on. If you're doing this like a lunatic, you read one for each. Montgomery number 1 is to read a book that has 5 to 10 books in the series. For this, I'll read Anne's House of Dreams. Fitting. Montgomery number 2 is to read a book that is part of a trilogy. I own 0 trilogies physically, unless you count the Dark Sword trilogy, which is annoyingly 4 books, all of which I have read. So this one is digital, although the trilogies there are few and far between as well. The book I picked is Natural 20 by Charlie Novak, which is the first book in the Roll for Love series. There are 3 books currently in this series, and the last one came out May 2021, so I'm pretty sure this will remain a trilogy. If a 4th book comes out between now and December, I'll figure something else out. Doyle prompt number 1 is to read a book that has more than 10 books in the series. Redwall comes in at 22, so my pick for this is Marl Fox. Marl Fox is the last Redwall book that I currently own, so the timing on this is great. I do want to finish the series, so I'll probably continue reading one a month into 2025, but they may have to be library books from this point on. I do kind of want to round out my collection, so it's possible I will try to buy them with my monthly book purchase if I run out of Donmei I want to read. Lastly, Doyle number 2 is to read a standalone book. For this, I will be reading The First Wives Club by Olivia Goldsmith. I love this movie, so when I was browsing books at my local thrift store and happened upon the book, I picked it up out of idle curiosity and discovered that the book came first. So I bought it. Now I'll read it. And that's the whole challenge. Wish me luck. If you plan to read any of these books with me, or do the challenge with your own books, or even do a different challenge, let me know in the comments. If you liked this video, I hope you'll watch more in the future. Thanks for watching this one. Bye!